Okay, welcome everybody. This is the breakout session for cooperative cost sharing system discussion. So how are we going to build a system where we can fund the development of open source software for Odyssey? And it's meant to be an open discussion. I'm really glad we have Clark here. And I will take notes as we go. I don't have a particular agenda. Clark, what are you thinking?
Um, so yes, I think that anything like this has to be done as a community. So I can start to lead a little bit, but I think that it's important for people to. I think it's important for us to come to a few, a general consensus. So one of the things that a couple of topics. First of all, we can have an agenda as follows. Number one, I could answer any questions that popped up during for the model that I presented, if we wish to go that way. One open discussion is just that we all have the same idea of the problem being solved. If we're thinking about different problems, then we're going to see different things differently. And there's numerous ways to solve some of these problems, and so we may want to focus on that. The what I would love to have is a group of people who are interested in pursuing this further at the end if they wish to, so that we can continue to meet and move along with progress. That would be my ideal outcome, but I can understand how if that's not an outcome. If we could just start with just fielding questions for maybe like 10 minutes or so, and then I would really I think for us to get a consensus as to what problem we're solving, because there's no point in trying to design or talk about a solution unless we all agree that we have the same kind of problem. So for that, if that's a good approach, then there's a few things that there are a few ways to raise money. One of them is like a Kickstarter like program. Another one is developer portals and other ways to add it, but or other ways to kind of get some kind of reoccurring monthly revenue, by donations of some sort. I found both of those to be a little bit of a challenge, which is why I came back to something like this. So anyway, let me. Could I just? Why don't I just ask if there are any questions of what I said? It was a lot of material.
So Clark, this is Paul. I have a couple of questions. And so I guess I thought maybe it'd be easier to start backwards. And so I've been able to be pretty lucky and successful at getting funding from grant agencies around clinical registries. And so if I want that software, I want to be able to put for me to put $100,000 into a grant, and that's going to generally go into a pot that would then support Commons development for a big project like Atlas. And so if I have money, the question is how. So how would I be able to then be able to put it into, is it a 501c6? Who do I have to contract with? I guess I would be interested to see how you envision the mechanics for delivering and distributing the funds.
Sure. So the general problem that I'm trying to solve is I would love to build a community of developers that's building something that's a lot more vertically marketed or vertically integrated, that's really competitive in a marketplace. And where the bulk of the bulk of the point is to get to an open source solution, but still have a very competitive high level product. And
And
importantly,
Clark, sorry
yeah,
to interrupt, can you describe what you mean by vertical integration?
yeah, sure. What I mean by vertical integration is your large companies, your Apples and your Microsofts, have lots of development teams building lots of things, and they have no problem sharing code among each other because it all comes out to a single set of products that are being sold. And as a result, they can move money around between departments, and there's no real worry about that because there's a lot of internal, let's say, cost sharing going on among groups within larger organizations. And when you're dealing with a bunch of small vendors, it's the cost to communicate, to share money back and forth in exchange for services gets to be prohibitively large. So what I'm looking at this problem from a developer perspective, and at some of the time, and then from an end user slash perspective from another time as to what I would want to see. So I really want, from the end user perspective, I really want to be able to go and see some products that I can download and use, not have to interface with some open source projects as a developer. And I find myself always having to do that when I don't really want to. I just want to be a user. Conversely, when I'm dealing with the community of developers, it's very hard to set up arrangements where you can share money back and forth, and very hard to get to contracting, and this is a challenge. If you're a software development firm and you want to bring in some components, you often find it's often easier just to write your own rather than try to contact a developer and track them down and figure out exactly how much money they would want. In the 1990s, early 90s, you had the Visual Basic component shop, which was great. You could basically, they had a great big huge catalog, and you can order all the components you needed in order to build your software. Something like that would be really very useful as an integrator or someone building medical research registries, for example, as I was at Prometheus. And so I think part of it is the problem being solved. You asked a specific question, which is, suppose that you got a grant to sustain Atlas. I would look at this as the grant would be seed money. And what you would want to do then is gather together a few developers and basically make a new version of Atlas with that seed money. But then I would, looking at this from a business hat, want to actually convert that into a more sustainable revenue stream. So I would think about, how do I recover the cost of that maintenance? And rather than necessarily that version being completely open source, some of it could be, some of that grant money could be used to build the next generation, which you then could spread your cost over a bunch of over the user community. And then as some revenue is collected from those costs from that version of the software, you now have enough money, ideally, in order to pay for the next set of maintenance, etc. So that initial grant doesn't become a perpetual request where you have to go back to the funding agency every single year and ask for money, where you just are asking for the seed money. And then you're sort of treating this Atlas development. And I don't want to, I don't want to provide a brand new way of doing Atlas, but if you thought of something like, let's take another example. Let's say that we wanted to have a clinical quality language implementation for Odyssey. That might be a fun one that I was thinking about writing a grant for. If we were writing a grant for that, I would ask for the seed money and SBIR to build it. But I would want to have this sustainable over the long term. So I would try to recuperate the cost by actually trying to sell it. And as soon as the first version is paid for, it's totally open source. And then that money could be used to, in order to improve it and make the next version, and etc., to where to where you now have a sustainable revenue stream that can come in as long as that work is really useful. And maybe over time, if you need less and less developers to maintain it and it just becomes a maintenance project, then you don't really have to do much, and eventually you could just make the final version totally open source and not worry about it. But I hope, I don't know if I've articulated um, that, or if I've just caused more mess.
Yeah, that was helpful. I think I was thinking about scale, because certainly you're right. It really is, if you're talking about a new redesign or refactoring of a major component, you're talking about millions of dollars. And that's really, that's not going to be supportable from one funding source at one time. And you definitely want to have a longer term. I struggle with the closed to open after a period of time, because it takes, I worry about them ever opening it. There's always, you feel like I always worry about that trust issue of things that are closed for a period of time and then get opened, because they seem to, once in a while, they go away and they never open them.
Yeah, this is exactly why a cooperative form is needed. In order to participate in this kind of organization, the one I'm picturing, individual vendors would never be selling things. What they're doing is very similar to a copyright collective licensing society. They're allowing a cooperative, which we democratically control. Collectively, the people who are involved have a say in how it's done, not the original vendor who does it. And in order to participate in there, you're saying, this is how much money that I'm going to get from this before it's open source. And I think the cooperative would put a time limit where, if you don't get your money back in 3 years, too bad. It's open source anyway. But the cooperative itself has the right to relicense at any time. And finally, as the third part is that if anything goes wrong with a cooperative, then everything becomes open source. So people who put their stuff in here are really going to be at risk. But on the other hand, this risk is borne by the developers and not by the users. So when you're coming back to trust, this is a really important point that we would want to make to our potential customers, just to say that this is not this is not a high risk. The second main difference in this setup, or this particular proposal, is that in a lot of these other ones, they say, oh, just trust us, we'll make this open at such and such a time. But until it's open, you still can't make changes that you want, because you don't have the right to make derivative works. So in this case, the developer would also contribute, or would also put in their source code, and also let anyone in the community make derivative works, including competing derivative works, or ones that improve on the software, or fix it, or specialize it to a particular medical field, etc. So that's a second element of security, that you're not buying software that is just dependent upon one vendor. You have a whole community of vendors and a whole community of developers who could help you. So I hope that I had brought that, or explained. I hope that explanation helps.
It was, thanks.
I did want to say, from the developer perspective, it seems counterintuitive that you would want to make your source code open so that someone else can build on top of it. And I want to explain that that's actually um, a different way of thinking. We need to think about ourselves in a different world, one where we're collaborating rather than necessarily competing. And I think this world is possible, especially with a community like ours. And in particular, um, when you make a derivative work, let's say that you Paul, you created a new improved version of some part of Atlas, and I may come along and make a specialization of that tool that is specifically used for, oddly enough, something crazy. I don't know, but adding a few more features. Now, when I'm making my sales to, say, a niche industry, let's say some hematology, where a bunch of screens are built in and everything else just to support a hematology research group, when the sale of that product happens, which is highly targeted, every single sale of that would also compensate the people who wrote components that we built on. So this creates this collaboration, a synergy between people who are building components and people who are building very specialized applications for particular niche markets. And this kind of way of going back and forth means that those who are building, the more generic your works are, the more you want people to build on top. Even if you think it might be just some small little changes to the application, they could fundamentally change a lot in terms of a user experience. And importantly, every single one of those sales, basically, when done right, just compensates back to where your work is paid off sooner, so that you can start working on the next version. It's a bit of a mouthful. I'm sorry. I've been thinking about this for too long, so um, if I go off the rails a little bit, please give me some overhead. The
Clark,
so yeah.
one follow-up thing is, I guess, two questions. One is, what is wrong with the platforms we currently like? I see what you're saying. I kind of haven't answered already, but what's sort of lacking in the platforms like Kickstarter or Fiverr or some of these like gig type things, so that can maybe get funded before the software is created? And then the second thing is, like, what's the fundamental infrastructure we need to, like, what are the key core components that we need in place to build this cooperative?
I think Kickstarter is a great model, and I think that perhaps the Odyssey community should really use that. Um, the One of the challenges with the Kickstarter product is that it doesn't provide this deep integration to where it can reach down and into all of the lower level components, or at least it requires a bunch of negotiation as to how that happens. And as soon as you have to negotiate and start thinking about these sorts of things, it really doesn't work very well. So the goal of this cooperative structure is to automate that developer communication overhead, so that so that as you're building higher level components, you know how much the total cost of your higher level component is, and you know how many units it'll be before it's totally open source, etc. And this is because you have a compositional model, and software is inherently compositional. So I that's one part. The second part is that when you have a Kickstarter project and all that, you still have to come up with the apparatus to make sales. And I do picture a cooperative like this to have an online store. And this way, there's a single place to buy things. Although you may be an individual developer, you could say, here's my product. And if you want to buy it, you can go to this web store to purchase it. And there's a lot to be said about having all that infrastructure taken care of for you. Kickstarter will do some of that, or actually quite a bit of it if you're an individual. So in that part, it's equivalent. So I don't. But once again, when a product is made of components, Kickstarter is not going to do that distribution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what do you think are the key components that we need if to make this cooperative model work?
I would think we should start really small. It's real experimental, and it may not work. So and I think if we start small with a small group of people, and I think an external group that realizes what we're doing and is cheering us on, then we could see if this works, and we could use small amounts, use small projects. I thought a couple of years ago that the data quality dashboard would have been a perfect little application to use in this regard. For example, a clinical quality language for OHDSI might be another one, provided that we can find some seed money to build it. But I definitely wouldn't make it a great big huge thing. And we can do some of the bookkeeping just by hand and paper, make a GitHub repository, and commit things. We do need some legal work, which we need to form an actual legal cooperative, and we need a board of directors and people that are operating. Hopefully, it wouldn't be too much burden. There's a lot of in the platform cooperative community. There's a lot of experience in running these sort of organizations. And I would hope that we could rope in quite a few people and saying, hey, we're going to try to do this with software, in this medical space, and we might get some buy-in. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, and it sounds like there's not a huge amount of infrastructure that we need to kind of get started with a small case. I will say this situation that we're discussing that Paul brought up, which is that someone has money, they would like some features added to existing open source software. It's something I've seen several times in my work at Odysseus, and before I joined Odysseus, I was in the position of trying to get some money to have some features implemented, and it's not really clear to a new person how to do that and where to go, and like how do you find a developer who can, because in OHDSI we kind of like shy away from talking about that situation, but as a user of the tool, there's definitely times when you don't have the skills or time to implement something, and you really need a feature or something added. So providing a way for people to kind of engage in that kind of exchange would be really nice.
So, although I have a model in my head that's rather big, we don't have to start really big. We could just start with a simple Kickstarter thing where we have a board that gets together, and this is how we do it. And I think running our own little Kickstarter might be very useful. A small little OHDSI store, where as soon as the little green bar goes up and it's full, then hey, that product gets funded, and we have the developers to do it. It's not at all the same model as this one, but it may be really the best appropriate next step for thinking about this sort of thing. We didn't, in previous works, I know that we had tried to collect money from several of our customers at Prometheus in order to build new features. And we would run into issues to where one model that worked really well was really Kickstarter, or I don't know if it worked really well, but where we would say, if we get money from 4 other institutions, we'll build this feature. But if we don't, then we won't. that sort of negotiation I think might work. I don't have direct experience in that. One of the problems with getting um, customers to fund features is that no one wants to be the sucker who does all the payment and doesn't actually get, that does all the work. And some organizations are very happy to do that because, they know it's a round robin and they know next time they won't be the one on the hook for building it. But other organizations don't want to do that. And it's often hard when you're paying for something to be free to get it past, finance and procurement. It's like, why would you do that? Why would you want to give something to be free and that kind of stuff? And it's a hard conversation. Where a commercial product that you have to pay and it's a compulsory license really fits into the kind of the ways that a lot of organizations, finance departments think about this. And some medical centers don't bat an eyelash at dropping lots of money on some products, but if you ask them to make a donation to the OHDSI community, they may really not be willing to do that. But once again, I don't have a lot of experience in this area.
My personal experience is that organizations care more about the feature and not necessarily about whether or not other people benefit from that feature. So if they need a feature and they have a way to pay for it to get it, then they're pretty much happy to share that. At least that's what I've seen. And yeah.
That's kind of a pre-coordination, right? It requires effort to figure out what the feature is, document it, get some examples, make a compelling case, and then go out to all the potential customers who would help fund the feature and go and raise that money. I think that's a great thing to do. The OHDSI community should definitely it is already doing that, right? Could continue and make that a little bit more public and maybe make some nice little green bars that go up. And but that's a little bit different from what I was proposing, which is more post-coordinated, where software developers or a group of developers get together and they just start hacking things out and they build it. And a lot of times it's much easier to make the case to a customer if it's working, and if you can demo it and show it and that sort of thing. So I think there's room for both, but I think that the Kickstarter like model is a little bit more like a grant, only that you're going directly to customers rather than a granting agency. Anyway, I'm uncomfortable talking about too much or talking so much. So maybe I could have someone else. But Paul, would you mind leading this a little bit more, if you don't mind? I don't. I think it's important to talk about these things, but I don't want to assume that what I was proposing is necessarily the right answer.
Sure. I'm not sure what I'm in a good position to lead either for that. But I guess the one thing I've been thinking about has been, studying other open source ecosystems and seeing that several of them have created a foundation as a way of handling the legal issues and handling the money. And often I think we've done well as OHDSI by avoiding it. I think we create real value and that there's real industries that are supporting OHDSI. And so it's interesting because it's a bit of a third rail where we've been so successful without addressing it directly. We certainly wouldn't want to kill the golden goose. And we're getting major support from industry, from academia, from health systems, and from industry. So, I mean, it's really actually impressive. And I think one way we do that is just because I think this is great for people's career development. People can align their work with it. And so that's how we've been able to piggyback a lot of volunteer effort with it and the goals of companies. But that won't really scale. That doesn't really help us raise a lot of money to do a major refactoring of our architecture, which we should be doing every 6 or 7 years anyway.
So I was thinking that one of the really great policies of OHDSI is not letting proprietary vendors be pushing their wares on the forums and stuff. And one way to try out a model like this to build new functionality, let's just say a clinical quality language, for example, is if we could have in the Odyssey community a friendly cohabitation with some commercial vendors who may actually raise capital or get SBIR grants in order to build out new generation functionality at high risk or reasonable risk, and but still allow them to be able to make talks at Odyssey communities with saying that, hey, this is okay, this is the here is the way that the software is on its way to being open source, and there's a cost sharing model involved in order until it gets there, and we know that this is a fluid way of doing that. I would personally be very reluctant to have a single vendor, give exception like that. But if we had an organization where most of the people who are running that are from the Odyssey community, saying, "Oh yeah, this has a somewhat of a blessing in that you can say, you can give a talk at a few Odyssey conferences, even though it's not yet open source."
Yeah, I would have to see that to see how that felt with our commitments and our values, and I agree. We're all about trying to support innovation. And I do think it would be great I have a better example for you. How about something that's going to create high value? So instead of clinical query language, which is a standard, and it's really hard to compete with standards and actually run companies, I was thinking of what if some company took Odyssey and was able to help us build all the HEDIS measures, all the quality reports that a health system needs to comply with. So it's a ton of work, and it's a huge industry, and everyone is reinventing the wheel every year with their ETL. And so I think what would be really exciting is if we can get a health system's data into OMOP, we could help them with all of their 900 quality metric compliance, which is immensely painful and expensive to health systems. And there needs to be a company behind it saying this ETL is correct and is signed off as an electronic clinical quality measure. And so I see that as, I think there's a service that needs to be provided. I would like to see that package as much as possible to be built off of a standard. It's just standard queries, right? Off of as cohort definitions is basically all it's going to be if you have got the right data quality assessment to be able to do the quality measures. But I think I find that would be, I kind of see that's where the closest putt is for creating a lot of operational value or compliance value with health systems. And there needs to be industry because we're not going to do this well just as a group of academics.
In my mind, I would really prefer if these things became open source.
Yeah, me too. Well, absolutely. I'd like it to be built off of an open library, but I do think at some point, even if it's open, health system needs is going to hire a company to implement it and get their check mark from the government.
So I didn't talk a little bit about one part of the model, which is trademarks, and that, companies would, in the model I presented today, maintain their own trademarks. The source code is shared, but those are not. And so you can have a product with a name out there that's well known and a company supporting that product. It doesn't mean, if we would use a model like this, it doesn't mean that a competitor can't come along and make up and fork it and make their own version. It's just that they would be using the same source code, but they would have to build their own trademark. And trademarks are really a significant barrier, and I personally think that they're significant and enough of a barrier.
Especially in healthcare.
Yeah, and so we don't. So we still could have a very shared open base, and if in this way, improvements to various tools could be done by external people. Anyway, that's a good idea. If we have other ideas, maybe we could make a list of people who want to cooperate in this way and form a group of vendors who want to participate. I even think a product like that, in specifically targeting the finance, quality, and of healthcare, that might be a small group of vendors. And I would much rather prefer it be done as a collaboration among Odyssey participants rather than a single company and going raising VC and then trying to build it and etc.
And the other fun thing is, of course, there's a technical specification now to electronic clinical quality measures. So it's nice because there's nice technical specs for some of it. A lot of the measures are not feasible in an OMOP world, but it still is something that I agree. It'd be nice if there was some way that we could help set the table for one or more companies to co-invest into creating that solution. Because that I see that would be a way of the immense value to reducing a lot of waste in healthcare in having to do quality reporting.
I like that a lot. I think that also is I've heard things like that. I, it would be great if we could find a group of vendors and make a meeting to do that. I'm a very collaborative person. I don't like to take an idea and run away and say I'll do it. No, it's much better if we all find a way and we all figure out what we can contribute together. And in a model like this, we would just all have some kind of, handshake agreement saying I'll build this part, I'll build this part. And then when you build those parts, those components will have a price on them. And as someone builds a specific solution to one area, then that works. And then they can compose the components together. And this way we don't have to be a big company. We could just be a whole bunch of small companies that are networked together.
I think in some ways we are searching for our first use case to see, and I think finding the right use case is really going to be a good challenge.
There are some proprietary products which offer beautiful interfaces on top of OHDSI software, and those are also commercial. It may be that some group of people might want to go start working on some alternative high-level interfaces that are a next generation that require significant investment. And I would rather those groups work together once again and in a way that we know that's going to become open source software, so that members of the community can invest in those, and not just money, but their time and everything else, knowing that it's going in the path that's compatible with our values. There's a lot to be done with cooperatives. There's a lot to be done for setting up a cooperative, and a lot of discussion that would have to happen. If you really want, if you're interested in these things, we could continue to have further meetings on it. You could either contact Adam or myself to be added, and if we have a quorum or enough people, we could get together and start working on these sorts of projects. In particular, putting together SBIR grants and explaining how we're going to go about doing it, and then working together on these things.
Maybe we'll have a quick poll. Maybe you can raise your hand if you're interested in you would be interested in joining a cooperative, and that would mean you'd kind of be a member and then would be able to license your software through a cooperative kind of arrangement.
So it's hard for me to say anything until I know how much time it's going to take to do something. But I certainly would be very interested. The other area that I think could be worthwhile is the idea around ETL and DevOps. Right now, ETL is done, is a heavy lift, and it's not done consistently and is not managed as a service. And so I do think Perseus, as a way of being a model manager for ETL when it comes to NLP and imaging, for it to be kind of a change control for tracking your data drifting. I still think, I think there's still a lot of work to be done to standardize the ETL side of managing a good, effective ETL process from a source data model.
Yeah, and a lot of what Odysseus does as our commercial service essentially is ETL. Yeah, so we're one of several companies, I think, that do that.
So there's two parts of this. One of them is finding, a developer community that what might be willing to start working in this way. You know, Whenever you're building software, we also need equity investors, and there's always the the risk of equity investors. Typically, when I want to them, they say, "What? Limit your return? No way!" And that's the end of the phone conversation. On the other hand, I think if we start with something really small, and we have a group of people building it, we can slowly, incrementally get some momentum where you deliver first few products, and if a few medical centers deploy it and collect a little bit of revenue, you can use the revenue in order to build the organization. So I think that's the only way that a model like this would go, because I doubt any VC would immediately be interested. Um, and the main risk, though, for from a perspective of someone doing a cooperative model like this, is that we could have trust in the users, potential users, would actually see us in a different light. If they see us and want us to be, and have as much, um, if there's not a little bit of deference given, then if we're just treated as a regular VC oriented group, then it really would make the part of the value of this is if we can lower our cost of sales and lower our cost of user adoption by having a model compatible with our values. And so I'm actually curious if anyone here is in the position to where they would look at products, and if they think that the values would actually make a difference, when selling to a medical system, let's say. So there's market research here.
Could take a few minutes and actually go through and introduce ourselves. So if you want to kind of participate in this conversation, we could kind of get to know each other a little bit. Because there's a lot of people on the call, but people are kind of camera shy, and but I think we got to get a conversation going with more people.
And so Clark, also, so I've done a lot of contracting on the health system side. We have gotten a lot better with open source software. We often ask for software in escrow. The other key is about the things that we want to consider, though, of course, is and there's just a lot of benefits because healthcare suffers so much from companies bellying up and obsoleting, that we often get software ripped out of our hands because they get end of life. That's actually become a much bigger problem than other issues. And so they end up forming what happens is a software company goes out of business, and then we end up building a co-op out of necessity of 10 other health systems just to provide, hey, can we all fund a developer to keep this system alive? So it comes on the other end as a co-op. And so that's usually the bad or the less popular way of it happening. But we do, things that we want in contracting are indemnification, of course. So that's what a company can provide that you don't want to provide as a software community. And of course, the other big thing is, as software developers, we enjoy doing things once. I certainly do. I do not enjoy doing the same thing 100 times. And that is why I want a company to deliver things as a service, is that it just, the love is not the same way. I like making an impact with it, but I lose interest after like the second time I do something.
It's often the 10th time when you actually make new insights, though.
It could be, and actually, you start building jigs, you start building all these other patterns of things to make life easier for yourself, and you start appreciating standards.
I love the idea of actually going around and having people introduce themselves, and if this is interesting or not interesting, or anything about it, would be lovely to hear.
So maybe we'll just start at the top. Maybe Animesh, if you are on, would you mind giving us just an introduction? What your interest is in the topic.
So I think Animesh is actually in another room because he's on hold, which means that he's probably in one of our other rooms.
Okay. So Antonella.
Ah.
Are you on? Maybe not.
It's a good way to scare people away, Adam.
Adam, this is Sanjay Udoshi. If no one else wants to break the ice, I will.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm a physician by training. My background is in internal medicine, and I trained at the Geisinger Health System. Did my fellowship in clinical reengineering and transformation. I worked for Oracle Health Sciences for a number of years, and then I moved on to, I guess I'll show my face. Then I moved on to work in the genomics field, specifically clinical oncology and genomics. So that's all pre-COVID. In the COVID era, our industry kind of took a big hit to the gut. A lot of my projects were in person and at institutions that were swamped by COVID. So I took a break and worked on academic projects, and that's when I tripped into the OHDSI world. And I worked in syllabus development for advanced medicine for Indian medical schools during that era. Once COVID lifted, I got really interested in implementing OMOP and started working for a consortium in Wisconsin, pediatric hospitals. And that was early last year. Since then, I've been working in learning healthcare networks, and most recently did deployment with the help of many members of this community for the International Rett Syndrome Foundation. It's a rare disease afflicting mostly females, young females. And my interest now is to continue to do some great work with these tools. The learning curve has been steep since I'm not a technologist by training. I'm a physician and somewhat an epidemiologist. Again, but I think that there are, my understanding of the institutions that I've been at, and there's been over 44 of them in the US and many outside the US, where I've either sold something or did something, is that there's a histogram, right? You have the advanced systems that have invested early and that have worked through their trepidation with open source, and they're ready. They've built the culture to implement in this world. And then there's the other side of it that are extremely COTS oriented. They don't understand open source. They don't understand the value proposition. And so it's harder to do anything with them. But I just, the opportunity to do just incredible work with what you guys are doing and building is evident to clinicians and frontline researchers, and it's just getting them oriented and getting them over what I feel is a pretty big barrier to entry, which I think we're getting past this year, is understanding how sophisticated these tools are. And they are often, for non-technical people, difficult to implement. We're used to one-click installers and things like that. That's not this world. So that's my background and perspective, and that's all.
Thank you, Sanjay. Dmitry, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. It's going to be brief. I'm Dmitry. I'm based in the DC area, and I'm the tech director in Odysseus. So, Adam, it's great to see you here on this screen. And my background is in life sciences. I have a PhD from U of W way back then. And I've been working in IT for about 23 years now, mostly in the DC area. And I've had gigs with med tech companies and federal contractors, web application development and such. I've also been trying to participate in open source communities. So I had been an active part in one of web app communities. And more recently, I took a chance to work with people on a blockchain startup. So that's, that was a very lively community with lots of ideas floating around, lots of crazy ideas floating around, and a lot of energy in it. It dwindled since then, obviously, but that was a very interesting experience, very different from federal contracting in this area. I personally think that these ideas that are brewing here are potentially fruitful, and I think that a community that shapes itself into a foundation or a consortium of companies that decide to undertake a task, like people were talking about previously, is a healthy way to go about it. But also, I think that it's important at the outset, it's important to understand the risks and the organizational burden that comes with it. Because a lot of open source communities, for instance, in my opinion, have the drawback of being loosely coordinated. So they don't necessarily all have the same aim, and they don't necessarily understand the purpose of their collective in the same way. And so it's important to stay in touch with folks. I think if you do form any type of environment that makes people collaborate, and it's important to keep an agenda in front of everyone so that we all understand where we're going and what the goals are. And starting small and having those small goals and going by small steps first and testing the waters before we plunge and on into it, I think is also a good idea. So I don't want to bubble forever because there's a lot of people who are in line after me. So probably that suffices for the beginning. I'd love to continue this conversation offline or in a different meeting with you guys, and hopefully we'll see you there. Thanks.
Thanks, Dmitry. Who wants to go next?
Hey, I'll go next. My name is Lynn Wynn. I am a senior cloud architect or consultant at AWS. And I've been in healthcare IT for many, many years. I won't say how many years because it'll be age defying. But my last several years have been kind of focused on getting folks to on their journey with creating a data lake house. I've been doing a lot of mappings between various EMRs to CDMs, which include OMOP, pCorenet, Sentinel, and I just see that that's a growing need. And so I'm new to this forum. I'm excited that you guys are meeting and talking about some of the challenges as well as meeting to develop or further the development of the OHDSI and OMOP use to add value. And I guess I'll just cut it there because I'll be brief.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. AWS has been a good partner for OHDSI, I think, and James Wiggins has been really involved in OHDSI community for a long time. Anyone want to jump in next? Javier?
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, hello. So I don't have as much experience as the rest of the people here probably, but I'm just here for listening because I think the conversation is very interesting. But I can just introduce myself a bit. I'm in Finland, and I work for this project that is called FinGen, where we have the DNA and the medical records of 500,000 people. And I work as a kind of developer, so I'm helping to build tools. We have this closed environment where we have different users that they are working with the data in a closed environment. And I'm helping to develop tools for the users to analyze the data. And then I discovered that there is a lot of tools already built in OMOP. So we converted the data to OMOP, and we are using those tools and making tools to simplify the use of those HDSI packages. And I think, in my opinion, there is also a lot of potential for doing that kind of software, like software that is useful for just analyzing your data, because most of the efforts in the community are used into doing this network analysis. I understand that those are more important, but in my experience, my short experience in Finland also, that I'm in contact with the hospitals, they just want to look at the data they have. They are not so much interested at the moment. So we are kind of building simple tools for doing that for Finland, and I would like at some point to open them and share them with the Finnish people I know, but also maybe with the rest of the people. So we have just some tools that you can just go to Atlas. We don't replace Atlas because it's really good for building a cohort. But we have a simple tool that just takes few cohorts and you can compare them. You can extract the features so that you can run some code-wise to compare or fee-wise to compare them. We also then send them and run some, we build some cohorts to then later use them to run some GWAS and things like this. So I just think that you want to build products, there is a lot of potential in that direction. That's my few cents. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Your experience also is similar to mine. So in industry where I've worked, definitely analyzing your local data is much more common than doing network studies. We do focus a lot on network studies in OHDSI, but there's a huge use case of just wanting to analyze your own data. So I think you would be actually a really good candidate as a tool contributor to OHDSI. So maybe I might ask you a follow-up question of like, what is your barrier to contribution? What type of scaffolding might be helpful for you? Is the cooperative thing part of that picture?
So I have been contributing. I mean, I have been part of this Keyron program. So I have been in the previous one. I have not been maybe taking advantage of the mentoring and all that. I have been just watching all the videos that you do and trying to learn. And I have been now learn how to contribute to the project. But at the moment, I have been doing it just when I find an error that stops me with what I'm doing. I just go and fix it and make a pull request, and it's accepted usually quite fast. But I think thank you for making me part of this cohort. I have been learning that because like 2 years ago, I was finding a problem. I was writing an issue and I was just expecting somebody will fix it at some point. So I don't have any barrier because you already helped me to overcome that barrier. But now if I have a problem, I go fix it myself and somebody get it if it's right. And I think it's really satisfying that I can contribute or what I do is taken into the project.
Yeah, and those contributions are huge. I think you have an opportunity too with the data set you have. You have genomic data linked to EHR data for 500,000 people, right?
Yeah.
So there's a huge opportunity for tools that take advantage of that type of data that I don't know how much exists right now.
Yeah. Yeah, like for example, this thing we have can be useful for other people who have the same kind of data. That we have this, as I said, that you can use Atlas to build very complex case controls, and you run a GWAS, for example, with the genetic data you have. Yeah.
Great. Does anyone else would like to introduce himself on the call? Tell us a little bit about what you're doing and what might make sense for you on this discussion. If not, maybe next step would be to kind of create an agenda for, I don't know, next steps or like, you know, if we have another hour, so we have time to really dig into some of this stuff. as well as kind of plan out what the next steps might look like.
Sure. Well, if for those people who would like to be involved in a cooperative, the one of the things that you have to do is there's a questionnaire that I could send out, and I could show my screen and we could go through some of it. But they're basic cooperative questions, and so some of those questions are like, who would be the members of the cooperative, and you know, how are they organized, and that sort of thing. And so that's one way to think about, or one way forward. Um, and I could share my screen with that if we want. And so that's one exercise that we could do in a workshop, and fill that out if, or if people want to respond with those sorts of things. You know, identifying who might be interested in making some kind of community and that would be interested in pursuing further is always great. The each coming up with an articulation of what the problem is also really important. So that could be an agenda item, like what exact problem are we solving? And then we could actually, I think it's important that any kind of cooperative approach, you know, the particular licensing mechanism I'm talking about is rather complicated. You know, would a simple Kickstarter solve the initial problems? So anyway, if we start with the problems, and then we could look at various ways of solving them, and then that might be a good first step.
Sounds good to me.
So did anyone want to speak with, I mean, the way I see the problem is, how do we fund more novel open source improvements, versus the other one is, how do we solve incremental improvements, where we can actually, you know, perhaps do some fundraising ahead of time because the scope is really clear. So maybe we should start with the latter problem rather than the former, rather than not thinking about new projects. Just think about what kind of cooperative group, or what kind of team do we need in order to do a little Kickstarter like thing, if that makes sense, where we can articulate what a funding proposal might look like, and then work through the market, you know, saying who are the potential customers for these kinds of things, how do we contact them, how do we advertise that Odyssey has these things available to fund it via Kickstarter. The nice thing about the Kickstarter model is that there's no proprietary work involved. It's pre-coordinated. You know, the project gets funded and then it becomes open source. So there's clearly no conflict with the existing direction of the Odyssey team. So perhaps maybe we want to focus the meeting on that, rather than, you know, on the more novel approach that I was proposing.
Yeah. Clark, what do you think about this? Like, having a way for both buyers and sellers to kind of propose ideas. So the other side of the market is like, someone needs an improvement or a feature, and they, you know, they would almost start a Kickstarter and say, like, you know, here's how much I'll put towards it. Is there anyone else who will put money towards it? And sort of like having a way for both sides to be able to, if you think about any marketplace, it seems like there's oftentimes two sides. There's people who are looking for something, and there's people who have something that they're willing to trade.
I like that a lot. Maybe make some way to where someone could say, these are the problems I have. Here's what a solution would look like. I'm willing to throw in $10,000 as long as we can raise $100,000 in the community.
Right.
And we would need to work out what a workflow would look like that, you know, for finding problems that exist that people want to solve. Or maybe it's a simple problem. I just need these two things done, and I think it's a $3,000 project, or I'm willing to put in X amount of money in order to get it done. One of the challenges there is who gets to decide when it's completed. If you have multiple people contributing to if they say I'll contribute $1,000 as long as 10 other people contribute, is that it? How do we then choose the developer who might implement it, or does it have to be a co-working? I don't know how that workflow would work. When you start thinking about it, how does that one do? Is it a bid like thing? Do people just say, do you put up a request and then various developers say, I'll do this, here's my estimate, and or is it or do you need a developer to pair with a person, which is probably more cost effective, where someone puts up an idea and then the community, there's a back and forth that goes on until there's a community consensus as to what the proposal is, and then that goes up.
Yeah, I mean, I would shy away from having to develop consensus around some of these projects, I guess, because that involves a lot of people. Whereas like a transaction could, if you have a marketplace where everything in the marketplace is kind of sanctioned, so any improvement, nothing even makes it onto the marketplace unless it kind of fits in with the values of the community. But once it's there, once it's in the marketplace, then multiple people might pile on and say, yes, I'd really love this. And then the price goes up, and then it attracts more attention. And then a developer says, all right, I'll commit to implementing it. Or a company could do that too.
We could have a GitHub ideas repository, and people could submit their ideas as an issue. And then there could be a dialogue, and then that produces a markdown document. And then and then that could be a collaborative project until there's enough consensus that it's worth funding. And then
I think a lot of the development does kind of happen that way. If you look at the software we have in Atlas and stuff, like this is not software that was developed by volunteers. This is like funded software that was developed by professional developers and in different organizations. And so there is a marketplace. There are transactions happening. So I almost think of this as like an evolution of that, where right now it's not really transparent and certainly not public. Some of the requirements might be public or might be discussed on GitHub, but really the marketplace itself is kind of behind the scenes. I would almost think of this as like an evolution where we all it is tricky though, because I think it is really nice in Odyssey that we have this place that's kind of free from all the commercialism and stuff. So it's I'm not sure how to walk that line exactly, but Dimitri, do you have comments on like your experience?
Yeah, I just had a brief comment that at some point it started to sound to me, at least, like a crowdfunding project where you propose ideas and you gauge the interest by collecting the funds for it. And if you collect enough of it, then you start developing that. So that's, one way to structure a marketplace like that. Another way to structure is, of course, just have a conventional marketplace where clients come in and they have a project in mind, and others can bid on it. There can be a fixed price for it and so on. And I think it's at the outset, it's kind of hard to say what's going to work for the client side, because I personally don't know their mentality well enough, and I don't think there is such a thing as a single client that's going to typify everyone in the marketplace. So I think we should be looking closer at the other side first to understand what the demands might be and how they want to interact with a community like that. And it doesn't rule out any particular way of structuring it. It just means that we'd have to probably figure out, based on our first engagements, if we get any engagements, and if they end up working, that's what we probably will go with as it develops. But I think it's important to involve people who will be our clients down the line early on, so that we understand what their vision is of such a community and or marketplace, and how they can work with it. structurally, legally, and also in terms of their vision as to how useful that might be, so that we don't wander off too far away from the reality of a marketplace like that. So I think that in early conversations, I think we should probably, like what we're doing now, we should form some kind of routes, possible routes to take for ourselves, and also a single way to present ourselves to the client community, and then go to that community and start the conversation with them and see how they react to that. Because one thing that could happen, I'm not saying it will, but it could happen, that we'll put in a lot of effort without knowing how the effort will be received on the other side. And so having a feedback from clients early on, I think is probably a good idea for us.
Actually, it's very interesting, regardless of what model might be picked, having a way to create the discussion back and forth between the users and the potential developers to scope out what something is before a lot of time is wasted is important.
I could, Dmitry, do you think that you could get that type of feedback through almost like through market signals by, let's say we set up like 5 Kickstarter projects or something, just a small number of projects that either someone wants to create and is looking for funding for, or someone else would like to pay for, and maybe see if anyone else wants to chip in. And then just see how well it works and see if there's other clients, I guess, willing to interact with that type of situation.
I think that makes sense. I think that having some kind of a page, like a landing page, where people can look at and see what's on the menu, so to say, and just shoot that by some more innovative players in the community that are acquiring goods, so to say, on the market, and ask them, what does it sound like to you? Would you be interested in that at all? If yes, then how would you interact with it? Because what I anticipate, I think, is that on the larger client side, there might be some hurdles as to how they deal with it. They're used to dealing with commercial entities, and they're used to dealing with other companies. They may not understand how to deal with an open source community, a crowdfunding platform, and so on and so forth. And so understanding their limitations early on, I think, is a good idea. And also involving them in that early is an element of sales, to put it bluntly. So I think that what you're saying, just having like throwing in 3 or 5 potential projects on a page, and then distributing this page and gauging the interest, I think, is a good starter for that.
I have an idea that I would love to see happen, which is just an installer for Atlas. So on Windows, I would click, download and install, and it would be like just the same as any other program that I normally install. Like right now, to install Atlas is a lot of steps, and yeah, it's like someone said on the call earlier, it's like definitely you have to be technical. You have to compile the source code to install it. So yeah, that could be something where I could see, where there might be other people who'd be willing to pay some little bit towards that, and then it would once the value gets high enough, then a developer might say, all right, I'll take that on and build it.
Well, I think if anyone is interested in the the core cooperative model that I was proposing earlier, I'm going to put my email address in the dialogue so that you could get in direct touch with me. I may see if I can get an SBIR grant to fund a few activities in that regard and see how that goes. But I love the idea of still doing something to open up some of the revenue options and the ways to connect, the people, the supply and demand for software based around Odyssey.
Javier, get your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to comment to what you just said, that you would like to see some easy installer of Atlas. And it's true that, for example, here in the hospital, here or also in Finland, they were hiring a company that it was installing Atlas in their own environments. And they had to do it because for legal reasons, but also because the people was not technical enough. So I think that maybe that money that was going to these local companies could easily go to Odyssey if they will have an easy installer, like you said. So it's like maybe there is some money that is being going somewhere else that it can be canalized to this community. In that, like with that example.
Yeah. I think that's one thing we miss out on in Odyssey is actually there's a lot of funding that goes into this whole space, but because people don't have an easy way to contribute it to the community, it doesn't make it all the way there. So we don't have this easy way to contract or say like, I want this feature and it will become part of the open source software, after it's paid for. But yeah, this is a simpler, what I'm describing is simpler than what you described, Clark. But maybe it's a easier place to start. And also it's completely compatible with the current status quo because it's everything that gets built is Apache licensed.
So there's two ways to think about this. One of them is that this is a pre-coordinated challenge versus a post-coordinated, and meaning we're finding the buyers and the sellers and we're connecting them ahead of time before any work is done. Yep. Versus we're going to do the work first and then we're going to go find our buyers. Right. That does reduce, it does mean that it's a lot easier to know you want to buy something after you see it. But the second thing is that the Kickstarter model still doesn't handle composition of software. Yep. So I think that that's really important to where if we've had a system like this for pre-coordination, and you identified a need, that person could say, well, I could do that, but I need the following two pieces. And then those become subordinate deliverables, which could either have their own funding or be nested. But some way to where work can be broken up among multiple organizations to where it's not just a single entity. This would allow, I think, a little bit more collaboration among the team. Maybe this is idealistic of me to say that, but one of the weaknesses is that it doesn't reflect the compositional nature of software if it's just single items. On the other hand, maybe if all the items are simple enough, it doesn't matter.
To me, it seems like the lacking piece is the composition of licensing, because if the software is all open source, then you can still do composition. There's no problem. But the issue is really how we do the composition of the licensing and revenue sharing.
Yeah, it's composition of the funding money, right? How do we compose? How do we, if we're going to break a task into parts and have different people work on it, how do we then make a single whole that is presented to the community?
Yeah.
But I don't know if this is necessary. I just brought it up as a point of difference, not necessarily a problem.
Yeah, I actually tried this a few years ago, I created a post on Fiverr for someone to implement a language server implementation for Odyssey SQL so that we could get autocomplete, and it didn't really go that well because I got a bunch of people saying they could do it, which seemed pretty sketchy. Like I didn't think that it was actually going to work, but I think having a place where people could go and say like, hey, this is something I really would like to have in the open source software, and here's some funding, it would be nice. Okay, well, so I guess what we have maybe for next steps is like 3 or 5 Kickstarter projects that we could kind of test out this idea, see if people want to fund open source through this mechanism. Are there any other, I guess, follow-up things or comments, or could also get some time back to our day? We might end early.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'll linger if anyone wants to ask questions for what I presented, but I don't have any particular thoughts about how to proceed.
Okay.
I'd say that it might be useful if people in this group who are online now, if they're interested in that, maybe they can raise their hand or drop their emails into the chat now line so that there's a mailing list so that we can communicate.
Yep, that's a great idea. So yeah, everyone who wants to be on the mailing list for this cooperative model, please put your email in the chat. Mine. Well, thanks everyone for attending the DevCon today. I think we can wrap up our session there, and thank you, Clark, for an amazing presentation and this whole idea around trying to build our economy around open source software. And I will set up a mailing list for people who put their email in the chat, and we'll continue the conversation in another meeting. So I took some notes, and we'll have kind of a follow-up report out next week on the Tuesday call. So, all right, thanks everybody, and have a great rest of your day. We'll end the call there. Bye.
Thanks all.